Thank you very much. Before I begin the formal part of my remarks, I want to just thank a few people who were incredibly helpful in preparing me prepare this address. Jackie Jones, Victoria Kidd, Jeremy Katz, Perry Nizzi, who was a soccer team coach, all my classmates that submitted surveys, which were very helpful, Deidre Peterson of the athletic department, and also it was incredible fun working with Annie Carl Halverson preparing this over the last several months. You are entering another dimension, a dimension of sound, a dimension of sight, a dimension of mind, a land of shadows and substance, a land of things and ideas. September 9th, 1972, 266 freshmen were dropped on a hilltop in Clinton, New York, and expected to learn what happened and how. You're entering the highlight zone. Our national atmosphere, a controversial president elected by a record number of votes, soaring gasoline prices, abortion rights in the headlines, impeachment being bandied about, the vice president, a graduate of Yale Law School, huge Middle East tension, astronauts being celebrated for a lunar excursion, an unwanted war, New York inflation busting out. Sound familiar? The difference between today, of which these comments may have reminded you, and our era, we still had a Gulf of Mexico. We each had our own unique journey to Hamilton. A kernel of my journey might be illustrative. Yes. In the spring of 1971, we had a day off from school, and my mother, a friend of hers from nearby DeWitt, heard that there was a fantastic bakery, the Clinton Home Bakery, that specialized in raisin bread. In Clinton, New York. In order to justify the trip to the bakery, she thought it'd be great if her friend's son and I, both members of the baseball team, would interview at the nearby Hamilton College while they shopped for raisin bread and other goodies. Root Hall beckoned as we got out of the car and walked across the quadrangle. Mr. Wilson and Mr. Effinger talked with each of us for about half an hour, then suggested that I spend some time with Christopher Covert, who was the head of admissions. I was a naif in the admissions process, and as a high school junior, knew none of the jargon associated with the process. My vague understanding was that you applied and you got admitted or rejected. After several minutes of what seemed to be a positive conversation, Mr. Covert asked me how I felt about early decision. I'd never heard of this term, but I assumed it was one of those highfalutin terms that colleges use, like calling a resume a curriculum vitae. I wanted to appear cooperative, so I replied I could decide as early as tomorrow morning. Mr. Covert lost a little bit of the enthusiasm I thought I detected, and I think I saw him write English 11 on a pad next to him. He proceeded to explain what early decision meant. I asked a clarifying question. Do you mean that I could get admitted to college before my fall grades are even known? He gave a speech about how a student was expected to work hard and earn good grades. I smiled. Another thoughtful applicant had been found. On September 7th, 1972, 266 of us began orientation. A large gathering was held in the chapel led by President Chandler, Dean Kurtz, and Dean Bingham. And we were told about various traditions at Hamilton, including snapping fingers instead of clapping, the honor code, the designated hitchhiking spots, the key role that our faculty advisor would play in our lives, the bumpy transition the college had recently made to coeducation, and how we would need to be on our best behavior to try and make the melding of the two institutions, Kirkland and Hamilton, better. President Chandler was from central casting for college presidents. He was tall, had elegant gray hair that was never out of place, and spoke with a stentorian voice that impressed us all. We listened respectfully or fearfully to the speeches that warned us of the difficulty of college work, of no longer being the academic stars, and of Hamilton's policy of grading to a metaphysical standard that no one could explain, except that it meant low was the norm. A Dean Kinnell study revealed the average course grades at Hamilton the prior year was 2.3 versus 2.8 at Colgate. 2 years later, John Sudsy Needham, class of 75, was explaining this grading anomaly to an admissions official at BU Law School, as we were assured the graduate schools would understand the Hamilton standard. The official listened patiently for a moment, then looked at John and said, "John, we have a saying in admissions, the thicker the file, the thicker the candidate." Kind of grows on you, doesn't it? John ended his soliloquy on the grading. Dean Kurtz, reminding us a little bit of his Heart of Darkness relative, explained the grades we might receive. Have you ever watched the evening news and heard a person was sentenced to not one but 2 life sentences? And you thought, well, that seems a bit severe. We had the same reaction. His explanation said that we could receive A, B, C, D, or an F, but that was not the end. Certain work might receive an FF for a, quote, serious failure, as opposed to the lighthearted F that was a 0 in your GPA. This had us all wondering, what did a serious failure mean to your GPA if an F was a 0? Do you now owe points to get back to 0? Would 4 double Fs mean a GPA of -1? Or did that mean you had to go back to high school? Later, we took placement tests for writing, for math, and for foreign languages. We began physical fitness tests and proficiency tests in carryover sports, which were sports meant to be played for the rest of your life. The physical fitness requirements were an interesting test of our acuity, not just physically, but also analytically. First, we had to demonstrate proficiency in strength through doing pull-ups, push-ups, and sit-ups. For speed, we took a running test. For carryover sports, there were choices both for warm weather and for cold weather, in which you had to demonstrate proficiency to avoid having to take classes in those sports. For winter sports, one sense of measuring difficulty became important. Many of us signed up for the test in badminton, believing we had mastered that at summer picnics. The test required you score at least 3 points in a game of badminton against athletic director Gene Long. No one disclosed Gene Long was national champion in badminton. It was a little like playing that octopus that predicts the Super Bowl winner. Every student that took that test qualified for a full winter of lessons. The basics of our daily lives for the next few years were now being established. Mail was delivered 3 times a day to the basement of Bristol, as was our only cheap form of communication. We were in the Bristol basement 3 times a day to see if any high school friends or girlfriends had written to us. Friendships were forming among roommates and other men down the hall. Daily routines such as brushing your teeth and showering became a subject of great interest, as we were introduced to the water being pumped from the reservoir above the college that filtered through layers of Onondaga limestone. The water was a shade of gray, not really translucent, and of a hardness that none of us had ever encountered. According to a study conducted by Professor Craddy of the chemistry department, it contained calcium, magnesium, 100% more iron than the New York City water supply, and was 35 times harder than New York water supply. 2 students in Dunham were knocked unconscious in a shower. A physics major managed to change the direction of the water coming out of the faucet using a magnet. The chemistry department actually collected water in a cistern to use in lab experiments because it was much purer than the stuff that came out of the faucet. The college assured us that water was potable, but not really enjoyable. Now, much that what one needed in life was available in Dunham or elsewhere. Now, today we have Amazon. In our day, we had Jack Syage. Jack was our Mr. Haney. Jack trafficked in army coats, sunglasses, Columbia record albums, and stereo equipment. Others were available down the hall if you wanted to get herbed up. The food at Commons, except for steak night, was what one expected from institutional food. In addition to eating, as Anne touched upon, one of the more common practices at breakfast was to launch fried eggs, Frisbee style, at the portraits hanging above the Commons tables. A particular achievement was to get the eggs to adhere directly to the eyes of the Soper portrait. Housing was a particular concern to all of us, in particular to the 240 young men that had been placed in Shawshank. I mean Dunham. Architecture of the type that Tim Robbins escaped made life exceedingly uncomfortable, but greatly increased the chance you would know your neighbor well in Dunham. The proximity of dozens of other men led to interesting pranks in Dunham. Alan Silverman remembers returning to Dunham in the middle of February to discover a full set of furniture arranged exactly as it would have appeared in a dorm room sitting in the Dunham parking lot. When Alan went upstairs to his floor, he discovered that the room from where that furniture had come was packed floor to ceiling with snow. The halls of Dunham proved to be a great spot to practice your slap shot or your tennis forehand. As we thought to abide by the wise words that we'd been told by President Chandler during orientation, the college apparently forgot them as we were doing our best to make the Hamilton-Kirkland relationship smooth. All the freshmen suddenly one day received a memo in our mailboxes from Dean the Bong Bingham that explained that next weekend the college would be busing in dozens of women from Keuka College and was looking for Hamilton freshmen to escort them. Unsurprisingly, the Kirkland women did not regard this as an act of peace. The final act of now opening the now enlarged campus was the dedication of the new Burke Library at the north end of the quad. A large beer truck from Utica Club was placed on the patio before the library steps, doling out free beer as we all celebrated this monument to Dewey Decimals. Bill Voorhees commented that the free beer and the same for the next 4 years is what he thought would be the case for the rest of his life, as he didn't realize you had to pay for beer until he graduated in 1976. During the opening, I strolled into the library to wander around the building that the Spectator referred to as looking like a large Exxon station on the quad. I wanted to patrol where all this loud orange carpets led. When I reached the second floor, a high school friend of mine who was in the class of 75, Dave Duggan, appeared and ran towards me and asked, "Have you seen the men's room?" I followed him into the men's room. Dave chalked his hands as he walked in, went into the stall, gripped the two new silver bars on both sides of the stall like Bart Connor on the parallel bars, and did a full L with his legs. Neither of us knew what all this equipment was in the bathroom. We were now seeing the first handicap toilet ever installed in the state of New York. We were now part of this spectacular campus with its alabaster dolomite stone buildings connected by a necklace of red shale paths, the quiet beauty of Root Glen, the towering elms and chestnut trees. Gary Buonanno mentioned he chose Hamilton partially due to its idyllic pastoral setting. After I looked up idyllic, I agreed with him. We were beginning to spend 4 years in a cocoon for our minds and personal confidence. The first class for many of us was English 11, as 2/3 of us had been required to take it. The first piece we were asked to read was The Case of the Spelunkian Explorers by Lon Fuller, a Harvard law professor. The case explored a fictional situation where a group of cave explorers was trapped for many years underground with a small supply of food, for many weeks underground. We were asked to discuss whether the marooned group below the earth was subject to the law of the state above it or is subject to a greater natural law as they sought to stay alive. The group chose to have a lottery to decide which of the group would be killed to be a source of protein. The premise was hypothetical, but the same dilemma occurred 6 weeks later in the Andes Mountains when a plane crashed carrying a Uruguayan rugby team. Survivors spent 72 days on the mountains and forced protein from their fellow passengers. College was getting interesting. At 10 a.m. Monday, the chapel bell sounded. We lived and were moved by the sound of the chapel bell as it both ended and began classes with its dulcet ring. The college was founded as a Presbyterian-inspired institution and remained one for over a century. Since the early years, mandatory daily chapel was required for all students, perhaps a burden for Christian students, but a requirement that amazed those that were not Christian that had to attend. As the 1960s unrolled and attitudes changed, chapel was reduced to one session mandatory weekly and then eliminated completely. In its stead rose Monday morning chapel. Classes were canceled from 10 to 10:30. Voluntarily, you could show up in here in an assembly that was led by what the Spectator called a witty interlocutor, which I again looked up, and Webster defines that as a wise ass. Freshmen would sit on the balcony, faculty and administration would sit in the front rows, and others would sit anywhere. The protocol was called Roman Forum, I think a reference to the Colosseum, not the Senate. As the audience was encouraged to shout out their comments at any moment about the speaker, they ranged from appraising a speaker's height by inference when yelling "stand up" at short people, snapping fingers in favor of a good announcement. Skits were staged, songs were played, karate boards were broken and demonstrated, and some serious moments for the whole campus were held there. On our first day, we left our 9 a.m. classes to see hundreds heading toward the chapel. We found our seats on the balcony to await the antics. The first speaker introduced was a senior named Dow Brophy. He was head of ZPG. We, the freshmen, had no clue what the initials meant, but the standing ovation in the chapel told us the only possible subject matter had to be sex. Dow said he wanted to introduce this year's models and began tossing condoms into the crowd. Turns out ZPG stood for zero population growth, and he was their campus representative. Now, this interactive feature with the audience made this a place that President Chandler and a few others did not like to tread, but others like Sidney Werdimer loved it. As we left chapel that morning, Professor John O'Neill, who's here today, was overheard asking a colleague, "Have you tried the new Watts systems," which was wide-angle telephone, which let you make unlimited phone calls for no money. Now, in those days, the college still employed a phone operator to direct phone calls, but technology was arriving on the Hill. I'm sure you don't remember this, John. During our years at Hamilton, we would prove to be somewhat ungovernable. While we were here, the president resigned, the vice president resigned, and that was just the United States. Deep into the winter of 1973, the Monday morning chapel filled. A solemn Sid Werdimer walked to the podium carrying a tape player. Had Sid discovered Steppenwolf and gotten a bootleg tape, we wondered? He pressed the play button and stepped off stage before the quiet crowd. A Mission Impossible-like tape began, and President Chandler's voice began saying, "Good morning, Mr. Phelps. By the time you hear this, I'll be in Williamstown." As he announced his decision to leave Hamilton, the crowd remained silent at both the news and the disembodied aspect of it. And then as the tape finished, Olive, one of the campus dogs, came trotting up the center aisle and released the only kind of streaming we then had. Several weeks later, on October 19th, Ernie Fung awoke his roommates at 6 a.m. in South Dorm, Ernie Fung from Hong Kong, to announce, "It's all white outside." Ernie had never seen snow. His roommates, Messrs. Morris, Geary, and Buonanno, had never seen 6 a.m. We now had 6 inches of white powder. The college's motto, "Snow Thyself," became self-evident. A year later, on a freezing winter's day, the chapel was filled as Dean Kurtz headed to the podium. Deeks blocked the left side door, left from the front, DU's the right side door, in the full chapel as the dean began his remarks. He too was resigning and was very focused on reading his prepared remarks. In the middle of his comments, a cold wind whipped down the center of the aisle of the chapel as someone had opened the front doors. A Kirkland woman, clad in only the gifts God had given her, plus a ski mask and sneakers, was sprinting down the center aisle, tracing the sine curve against the horizon. She reached the podium and turned left, her left, as part of a rapid exit. The Deeks had not been given her plan and did not move. Dean Kurtz, unaware of this unmounted Lady Godiva, continued his remarks. She reversed course, again passing by the podium, which did catch the dean's attention, and headed for the opposite door. The DUs, showing their respect for the dean, remained still and blocked that door. At this point, Dean Kurtz, muttering to himself, "What the devil?" left the podium, assumed the role of Moses, and parted the Red Sea like DUs and let her out of the building. The devil wore nada. Streaking season had begun in Hamilton. Many different streakers appeared that winter. For a period each night at 9 p.m., people would gather around the central atrium of the library expecting a runner. They were never disappointed, although one fellow circumnavigated the land on a bicycle wearing only a scarf. One memorable night, a mutt and Jeff Twosome appeared at the threshold of the carpeted stairs on the third floor and wearing only Converse and ski masks. I will not use real names, but let's refer to these two as Sal and Tom, so we can distinguish them. Sal was a diminutive fellow with olive skin finished with a swarthy coating of hair, and possessed a memorable giggle. Tom, a tall, gangly runner with skin the color of fish belly white, set the pace. They reached the second floor with a certain amount of grace, but the blinding effect of the ski mask sent Tom tumbling toward the rug, and Sal to the high decibels as his giggles rose. Tom recovered his balance like a bear Baryshnikov and danced to the first floor as the crowd applauded the effort. Unlimited beer and limited supervision combined to activate some of our more primitive genes. A hallmark of several late nights was demo, short for demolition. Windows were broken, furniture was tossed, and general chaos often ensued. After one episode that caused several $100s of damage, the dean required the perpetrators to turn themselves in, or the entire class would be billed for the damages. Remarkably, they did, as Hamilton's honor code was having its effect. 2 or 3 more serious episodes of demo took place. Professor Wertimer appeared in chapel to lecture us on the problem. Near the end of describing in detail the damage that had been done to the college and how disappointed he was in the behavior, he told the story of a prior generation that had placed 2 cherry bombs in the loins of the Alexander Hamilton statue, causing $1,000 in damage. After a brief pause with excellent timing, he analyzed this to mention that this was about $500 apiece, and brought the house down. One of our classmates, Steve Gorman, is now an advisory policeman, skills we could have used then. We lived just above the bucolic village of Clinton, New York. The village was still somewhat cast in its idyllic period from the 40s and 50s. It had its own bakery, the Clinton Home Bakery, the Park Row Pharmacy that sold both pharmaceuticals and scoops of ice cream, a local theater named the Cannonball, the Cider Hall, and of course, 2 local taverns, the Rock and the Village Tavern. Jacob Verhoeven, the owner of the bakery, had learned to bake in his village in the Netherlands as a teenager in order to help feed people because the Germans had occupied his town. All his baked goods were savory, but the raisin bread was world class. He was also a savvy businessman and realized that late Friday nights, most of the Hamilton College students were getting oddly hungry. Perhaps because of a visit to Fangito's field. Hearing of late night demand, he decided to open his bakery at midnight every Friday. Long lines formed late at night to purchase the raisin bread, the homemade donuts, and the other delights that he had made for the weekend. Also, Jacob delivered fresh homemade donuts early Saturday and Sunday morning to each of the frat houses on College Hill. Now, the relationship between the college students and the town was very good. Members from the Teak fraternity volunteered to clean up the local Civil War cemetery, others to tutor inner-city Utica and Clinton students that needed help, others to offer aid to patients at Marcy Hospital, and on campus helped tutor students and played sports with students at the ABC House. Also on campus, the kindness continued. One member of our class, Stephen Blow, was completely blind. Many of us volunteered to read textbooks to Stephen. For some of us, although we were taking the same classes as Stephen, it was the first time we'd actually seen those textbooks. Stephen, to his credit, went on to graduate from Cornell Law School and had a long career as an attorney for the state of New York. The acts of kindness went in both directions. Victor and Shirley Fax from Utica opened their home to several students at Hamilton, including two of our classmates, Ernie Fung and Stuart Mazinski. Ernie, of course, could not easily return home to Hong Kong on holidays and was grateful for being a guest in the Fax home, and later for help they gave him after Hamilton. Stuart could return home, but it was in Cleveland. Cleveland, a city whose mayor, Ralph Perks, in December 1972, and his wife were invited to dinner at the White House, turned it down because it was his wife's bowling night. Later in the 1990s, remembering this kindness, Stuart and Ernie's families each made gifts to Hamilton to set up an award named for the Fax family for simple acts of kindness done in the community, which I applaud. The challenge of governing us had yet another chapter to be written. In December 1973, Joe Sisko from the State Department was named our new college president. To great fanfare, he appeared on this very stage with his family to express his ardor for the college. Moments later, he received a phone call from Henry Kissinger, his boss, saying to him, "Joe, I need your help here in the State Department to help with the Palestinian situation." His term ended in fewer days than that of Pope John Paul. The trustees returned from the airport. They selected Martin Caravano, who served the college for well over a decade. Now, we had our own thirst trap on the hill. It was a basement. With a 7-foot ceiling beneath commons, the pub served beer, popcorn, and bon ami. It was filled with cigarette smoke, the floors were like a glue trap, and it was as roomy as a porta potty. We loved it. The Deeks seemed to occupy a frequent flyer status in that pub that led to free beers and to peculiar inspiration. One late spring evening, Jim Lotz, Buzz Morrison, Walt Stooges, and the late Dave Marshall, inspired by More Utica Club, concluded it was important that the next day they appear at the opening game of the New York Mets. They tumbled back to the frat house and shortly later were buzzing down Route 17, stopping once to wire the muffler back onto the body of the car. Early in the morning, they arrived in Manhattan at the apartment of their freshman RA, Craig Callan, and asked to crash. Craig, as a recent graduate, was now able to read newspapers. After browsing the Daily News, he queried, "Did you guys say you were here for the Mets opener?" And they nodded yes. Pointing at the newspaper, he drawled, "It's in Cincinnati." They raced back in time to attend afternoon classes. Travel away from the college seemed to often create stories that we can add to this 3-story chapel. One long weekend, a group of our classmates headed to Skidmore College. Now, in the 1950s, when the New York State Thruway was being constructed, for efficiency and other reasons, rest stops were often built opposite each other on both the eastbound and the westbound sides of the Thruway. One of those, in fact, happened to be true at nearby Little Falls, New York, and in addition to the 2 rest stops, an overhead bridge across the Thruway connected the 2 so you could walk back and forth. I guess the reason was in case you're out of toilet paper on one side. Though this group stopped on the Thruway at Little Falls, and people tumbled out of the car, and they all walked up onto the bridge, went halfway across the bridge, and stood over the Thruway. Now, at this point, as they stood there, they waited, and groups came from the other side of the Thruway and walked across. And they were also carrying with them, as was this group, their Thruway ticket. Now, in those days, the Thruway tickets were issued, no matter which direction you're going, the same ticket to both parties. So if you had a ticket and you drove all the way to Buffalo and never stopped on those overhead bridges, you'd pay that distance. But you'd only pay the distance between the point where you entered and where that card left. So as they swapped cards, you were suddenly able to drive back in the direction in which the car had actually been issued. This is sort of a mileage version of Benjamin Button. Now, the only challenge was to make sure you didn't get off at the actual exit where the card was issued. It was very hard to explain in 3.5 hours how you hadn't traveled 1 foot. Now, I'm not going to reveal the names of the people involved in this because we don't know the statute of limitations on illegal use of a toll card, but these guys all became Wall Street traders. Now, cars were mostly dull, and they were old Volkswagens and Chevys on campus, but two were memorable. Bill Purcell rolled around the Mohawk Valley resplendent in a 1957 Cadillac Coupe de Ville with power windows as he channeled his inner boss hog. And Rand Carter shuttled around in his Rolls Royce and is pictured in our yearbook during the Deke Easter Vigil, resplendently supplying in his own back seat with his eyes closed. Music played a huge role in our 4 years on the Hill, whether it was the music blaring from our speakers, which were large enough to be visible from outer space, perched in the windows of our dorm rooms, or an array of large or small concerts held around the campus in the alumni gym, the chapel, or in the Kirkland Coffee House. Music was ubiquitous. The Hamilton Folk Festival was notable for its display of local talent and once included the original hit, the Waffle Ceiling Blues. Wafting from the dorms one night, might hear Led Zeppelin, the Eagles, the Temptations, Carole King, the Doors, Spencer Davis Band, or the Spinners, or sometimes Bach. For those that enjoyed both classical and rock, you might hear Procol Harum. In concert, we saw Bonnie Raitt, Orleans, Elvin Bishop, Persuasions, the James Montgomery Band, John Prine, and Steve Goodman, Loudon Wainwright. Dennis Welsh found Steve and Loudon giggling and hungry out in the darkness and sent them to ELS for their midnight servings of peanut butter and jelly. Steak Night and Uhuru were also excellent school student bands that we were heard playing at campus parties and concerts. We also had excellent films on campus, many of them brought to us by Barry Kreisworth of Ammonich. Choices ranged from The Graduate to Wild Strawberries, and were often preceded by Flash Gordon shorts to excite the crowd. Images and memories of the faculty remain strong in our mind. Professor Anderson wearing coat, tie, and red high-top Commerce sneakers. Professors Colby and Barrett strolling around wearing capes on campus. Professor Wagner's belly laugh, Professor Wertimer's carefully tied bow tie, Robin Kinnell in custom lab goggles, and Professor Jones walking his low-slung basset hound Jennifer all come to mind. Annie Carl and I sat in class in Professor Ogilvy's calculus class in the science building. The setup was 3 rows of chairs, blackboard between 2 doors that were left open to the hallway of the science building. As Professor Ogilvy went across the board, he reached the right-hand side of the board while doing a proof and talking. He then walked out the right-hand side door. Annie and I looked at each other, not sure what he was doing. We continued to hear muttering in the hallway. He re-entered the left-hand door about a minute later. He was well ahead in the proof. We just shook our heads. In the surveys, many mentioned how important professors and coaches were in their lives. Asian Ed Lee was mentioned by many. Bob Howe, Steve Gorman, Bob Greaves, Walt Stugis, and Alan Silverman as being a trusted mentor. Ed Lee even vacationed, he was an Asian history professor, even vacationed with the Silverman family. Because when your 6-year-old asks about the Ming Dynasty, you better have answers. Professor McManus started Joe Peschman on studying ecology, which became part of his career. Doug Glucroft watched and analyzed the Watergate hearings with Pete Suttenmeyer. Fred Wagner, John O'Neill, Oscar Briggs were all mentioned as being inspirational. Steve Shiz remembers on winter study being in Moscow where Professor Haltzel led students in singing the Star-Spangled Banner with Tbilisi activists during winter study. Mitch Radin and Tim Woodlock also took the 30 Plays in 30 Days program that Ann mentioned. However, the scheduler for those events apparently had too much wine and scheduled them to see on the first night Henry IV Part 2, the second night Henry IV Part 1. They were amazed to see Henry get younger and Falstaff get thinner as the play progressed. Great speakers in theater marked our time on the Hill. We heard lectures from B.F. Skinner, who denied putting his daughter in a Skinner box, Thomas Eagleton, and Andrew Young, who was quoted in The Spectator as saying, "The fighting of injustice requires testicular fortitude." We saw HMS Pinafore in this room, featuring Sam Babbitt and R. Chris Caswell from our class, 1776, and AD annually would host My Fair Kirky, a play unlikely to find a producer in today's environment. Small memorable events also filled our lives. Jim Laporte recalled watching the aurora borealis one cold winter evening. Doug Kinney tells the story of staying on campus in the Delta Phi basement to repaint it over spring break, and each day he kept hearing a distant piano play Chopin. He went to investigate the wonderful music to find the player was Tony the Bundy maintenance man at the keyboard. Rick Corman and the late Linda Anzalone remembered the beautiful solitude in Root Glen, sometimes broken by the sound of an acoustic guitar or a bagpipe. Often, the faculty would be blunt in their assessment of our work. Jim Benson reports that on one of his papers, Yvonne the Terrible Markey wrote, "Trite, pompous, and wordy." Jim says that was much better than high school. I submitted a Blue Book essay on Huckleberry Finn to Professor Wagner. In the margin next to my section on Twain's technique, Wagner wrote, "Idea not fully developed." I thought, what a thing to say about Twain. Some were more nuanced. Jim Falvey, when noticing that the late Brian Smith had had an early start to house parties and was asleep on his desk during class, Falvey asked the class, "Do all of you notice Brian checking his eyelids for pinholes?" The inordinate attention paid to us peaked in our senior year. The Spectator ran an article listing faculty-authored books that were recently published. Professor Fred Wagner had just had his publisher release his new nonfiction book titled Robert Morris, Audacious Patriot. Was I flattered? I wrote to Fred, one of the things that attracted me to Hamilton was the low student-to-faculty ratio. But I never thought that an unauthorized biography of me would be put together by a faculty member. Fred wrote back, "You're welcome," and signed it Boswell. Sports, both team and intramural, are a large part of our lives on the Hill. The football team was so intimidating that our first opponent, Haverford College, did not arrive, as they could not field enough players to be a team. The record did not improve after that, despite Dave Jolson and Craig Sonnenberg leading the kazoo band at halftime. However, Gene Long, as athletic director, introduced a Grover Cleveland strategy for coaches. At the end of the first year, he removed Coach Jones and replaced him with Coach King, who he replaced with Coach Jones at the end of the third year. Coach Jones led the team to a 4-4 record our senior year. Nothing was more fun and more exciting than heading over to Sage Rink and watch the hockey team in our Coliseum. Our team had a winning record led by Rick Anderson and Dickie Malcolm. Cross country had a great 4 years led by Bruce Carter. They were 26-4, and swimming led by All-American Joe Schrum from our class was 33-8. However, the top sport on our campus was beer drinking. Psi U felt the responsibility to rank the talent in their annual beer drinking contest. As in golf, they wanted to be fair, so they assigned handicaps to each drinking member of the fraternity before the contest began. A large, impressive lad, Vlad Hoyt, was given a 0 handicap. Our diminutive Scott Atwater was given a 6. As the contest progressed, penalties were given for technicolor yawns, as they called them, or to spillage. No All-Americans were named. On June 2nd, 1976, 5 inches of snow shrouded the campus as we prepared to commemorate Snow Thyself 4 days later. We threw snowballs one day, then golfed the next. On June 6th, at graduation, we were the inaugural class to be given wooden canes as we crossed the stage. We've gone from a generation passing joints to one that's now replacing them. We now have a chance to use those canes. Faulkner wrote, "The past is never dead. It's not even past." This large group of my classmates is testimony to that. Thank you very much.